In the last video, we looked at multi-step workflows using a single promise chain. We fetched the data one piece at a time because we needed some information from the first value to make the next call. It's much faster if we don't need to execute our async operations one at a time. Instead, we typically make a few calls to fetch data at the same time, but we still need to wait for all of our data to get fetched before acting on it. This is where Promise.all comes into play. We'll set up a few async operations that will resolve at different times to demonstrate. We'll update the resolve value and delay for each so we can distinguish between them. So each of these promises will resolve at different points in time. Then we'll run Promise.all, passing in an array of the promises. As usual, we'll add a then and console log the resolve values. And we'll add a catch and console log the error. As soon as the Promise.all line is hit, all the async operations will run. When all of them have resolved, it'll get into our then. So we expect it to take about 4 seconds because the longest delay in our array of promises is 4 seconds. Let's add some breakpoints and watch it flow through the code. We'll run it in debug mode so we can see it hit all the breakpoints. So first it hits Promise.all. Then the second promise is the first resolve because it has the shortest delay. Then the first promise, and finally the third. After all the promises have resolved, we get into our then. And the result we console log is an array of the resolve values. But notice that it's in the order the promises were passed in rather than the order they resolved. What if one of the promises is rejected? Let's set up the second promise to reject, since it's the quickest to resolve. We'll run through in debug mode again, but this time we expect it to get into the catch instead of then. So we see that the promise rejects and goes into our catch. But we still get into the resolves of the other promises, but not the then of our Promise.all. For Promise.all, as soon as one promise is rejected, it immediately fails and goes to the catch. But it doesn't cancel the other promises. The Promise.all chain rejects, but if we add a separate then onto one of the promises, we'll see that it still gets into it. Let's run this to see it get into the then, even though our Promise.all rejects. We see that the first promise resolves after the Promise.all chain has been rejected, but we still get to our console log here. And we never make it to the Promise.all then because we went through the reject flow. Lastly, let's take a look at what happens when one of the items in our Promise.all call is not a promise. Let's remove this extra then and change this back to resolve. And we'll add a non-promise to our Promise.all call. When we run our code, we see our non-promise value treated the same as the resolved values. What actually happens here is the non-promise is converted to a promise that immediately resolves. That just about covers Promise.all. We saw that it takes an array of promises, but can handle non-promises too. It will resolve with an array of the resolved values for each promise, and the order of the array matches the order they are passed in when calling, not the order in which each promise resolves. If any promise gets rejected, our Promise.all chain immediately rejects, although the rest of the promises will still go through their reject and resolve flows separately. What if we wanted the opposite? Instead of waiting for all of our promises to resolve, what if we just wanted to wait for the first one that resolves? In the next video, we'll look at a promise method which resolves or rejects as soon as one of the provided promises resolves or rejects. It's called Promise.race.